Over the past couple of years teaching countless workshops, I've been asked so many questions around wafer paper, and today I'm addressing all the frequently asked questions, and I hope it will bring you more clarity and help you remove some roadblocks while working with wafer paper. There are a total of 14 questions, and I split them up into 4 main categories. Number 1, basic wafer paper fundamentals. Number 2, coloring of wafer paper. Number 3, using wafer paper flowers on cakes and storing them. And lastly, why should you be using wafer paper? These categories are also organized as chapters under this video, so feel free to jump in the section that you're looking for. But if you're a complete newbie, I recommend you following the sequence. Now, let's start with the basics. Let's start with what is wafer paper. Wafer paper is made up of a combination of potato starch, water, and vegetable oil, and they are dehydrated into pieces like this. They are generally made in white, but you're also able to find some colored ones. Is wafer paper edible? Because they are made of edible ingredients, so yes, wafer paper is edible, and they are generally tasteless unless you add some flavoring to it, and that can come in a form of dry powder, some sort of concentration, or flavored coloring. Where do you get your wafer paper? I love using this brand called Oasis Supply, and I get them from Amazon. I think this is a more widely available option internationally. Link to this is in my description box below. Are there different types of wafer paper? Basically for wafer paper, the only difference is generally the thickness. There are 3 main thicknesses and they are used for different purposes. I've done a separate video on this, explaining them in detail and elaborating on what you can do with all the different thicknesses of the wafer paper. You can find it in the link above here. What brand of colors do I use on wafer paper? This is a very common and important question, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. Stay with me. Before we go into what brands of colors to use, we need to understand first how are we using these colors. To get our colors into a paintable consistency to paint on our wafer paper, well, think of it like watercolor. We'll need to have a combination of color and clear liquid. And this isn't just any clear liquid. For us to shape our wafer paper and have it hold up in the end before attaching onto our flower, we'll also need a variable that helps it dry out slightly at the end. If not, our wafer paper will remain wet and soft. And since there are 2 variables in this mixture, the brand of colors you use will be dependent on the clear liquid you use, vice versa. The clear liquid I use is vodka or any 40 to 50% content alcohol. And with the presence of alcohol, I'll need to work with a brand color like Sugar Flare or Wilton that has an ingredient called glycerin in it. Glycerin is an oil-based ingredient which is also a humectant. What a humectant does is that it helps to retain moisture, and this allows my wafer paper to stay softer for a longer period of time as I color and shape it, and the alcohol will then help to dry out at the end when I'm done. So glycerin is a key ingredient here in this mixture. It can come from either your color or your clear liquid. If you're using a color without glycerin, then I'll recommend you using a liquid with some glycerin in it. And since I'm using alcohol to help me with the drying out part, the glycerin comes from my colors, so I'm using Sugar Flare or Wilton. Lastly, note that the combination you go for also highly depends on the environment you're in. I have a whole video explanation on this, and the link to this video is here. How do I color and shape wafer paper petals? After learning what colors and liquid to use, now we're ready to go into the how. I have a class here absolutely for free, and in there I go into detail on how to color, shape, and vein my wafer paper petals. You also learn how to make these beautiful looking cosmos flowers. Check out the link in the description box below. It's called Free Cosmos Class. Can I use airbrush to color the petals? If possible, what type and brand of paint and airbrush do I use? Well, I do not recommend using airbrush to color your petals due to the fact that wafer paper is so sensitive to both the amount of liquid and the consistency of liquid being applied for you to shape a petal well. Refer to the next question for explanation and some visual demonstration. I have a question about veining petals. Why don't I get much veining on some of my wafer paper petals? Well, the trick to being able to get good veining is, number 1, you have to use the right color and clear liquid combination, as mentioned above, for your environment. And secondly, to be able to get the right amount of liquid on your wafer paper. I did a video demonstration here sharing all the right and wrong ways of getting veining on your wafer paper petals and how to troubleshoot them. Remember to go check it out. I would love some tips on storing wafer paper and cakes in summertime, warm weather. Once a buttercream wedding cake is decorated with wafer paper flowers, How can it be kept cool? Can wafer paper go in the fridge? Okay, there are so many questions here, and I believe the underlying concern here is with regards to preserving our wafer paper flowers and preventing it from melting or softening. Before I go into the 2 points I want to explain, we'll first need to understand the circumstance that will make our wafer paper melt or soften, and that is when there is an excess amount of liquid on our wafer paper. This was demonstrated in the earlier question where we have to add enough liquid to soften and shape our petals. Once our flowers are done, to keep them as pristine as they are, we'll have to make sure that they stay in an environment which is fairly dry. And this brings me to my first point. If you're in summer and the air is dry, your wafer paper will do just fine because the heat itself is not enough to kill the wafer paper flowers. The wafer paper flowers will only soften if the humidity is very high, like 80% and above. Point number 2. Once the buttercream cake is decorated with wafer paper flowers, it's perfectly fine to store the cake in the fridge, provided the air in the fridge is relatively dry. What you want to take note here is after you take the cake out of the fridge. If there isn't too much condensation happening on the surface of the buttercream where your wafer paper is in touch with, then your wafer paper will stay just fine since there isn't any excess moisture. However, if you know that there will be a lot of excess liquid due to condensation, which is caused by the drastic change in temperature, the next time before you place your wafer paper flower on your buttercream cake, apply a thin layer of melted cocoa butter on the surface or on the back of your wafer paper flowers, or wherever that is coming in touch with the buttercream. The cocoa butter, which is the oil-based ingredient, will act as a barrier, preventing water from seeping into your wafer paper flowers, hence preventing it from softening too much. All that being said, based on my personal experience, condensation usually happens only for a while, and when it's gone, the buttercream comes to room temperature and your wafer paper flowers will stay up just fine, meaning it will not be too soft or it will not melt. If you're still unsure and want to try it out, just go ahead and try out on a small flower or even just one small wafer paper petal and place it on a buttercream surface in your fridge, and then go through the whole process to know what will happen in your environment. Can wafer paper be placed on fondant cakes? Following up on the previous question, if you're placing your wafer paper flowers on a fondant cake, the fondant is actually way more sensitive to condensation as compared to your wafer paper. In this case, I recommend you to leave the cake that is decorated with wafer paper in an air-conditioned environment instead, where both the fondant and the wafer paper flowers can stay up well together. Can I decorate an ice cream cake? Do wafer paper flowers spoil if placed in the freezer? The first part of this question is already answered previously, and to the second part of your question, no, your wafer paper flowers will not spoil if they stay dry. Similarly, look out for possible condensation when they're taken out of the freezer. If I had to ship wafer paper flowers, how should I package them to protect them from possible shocks and preserve them from breakage? Well, I would package it like how I would usually package fragile items with loads of soft protections around it. Thankfully, wafer paper isn't as prone to breakages as compared to gum-paste flowers, so some light knocks are totally fine. I would either, first, place the flowers really tightly together so they act as one another's support, like this, or I will place loose tissues and peanut foams like this to prevent breakages from possible hard knocks. On to the last 2 questions. These 2 questions revolve more around the mindset of using wafer paper, and I would love to address them here like how I've told so many of my students. What is the selling point of wafer paper flowers? Well, I would paraphrase this question as to what are the advantages of using wafer paper flowers instead. Personally, I like them for 2 main reasons. One is how lightweighted wafer paper flowers are. This allows me to go really crazy in terms of the number of flowers, the style, the ways I use my flowers, without them weighing down on the cake or restricting the flower movement I can design on the cake. The second reason is similarly because of how lightweighted it is. It allows me to create a very multi-layer look for flowers like the peonies and the ranunculus, which make them look a lot more realistic and interesting. The best part about them is they don't break when you accidentally drop them. And I'm ending off this questionnaire with a very interesting and really important one for all of us to remember. Which one will be more popular in the future, wafer paper or gum-paste flowers? Well, over the years, I have so many students ask me these questions so they can decide on what they want to focus on learning or making. And here's my take. I can't predict or control the future, and you cannot too. So I would say try both mediums and see what you like to work with best, or at least understand the pros and cons of each medium, and from there decide what you want to use or focus on. If you decide to just jump on a trend or follow what others are doing without even liking it yourself, the chances are you'll just end up with a burnout in the long run. But if you do something that you really like or love, the chances are you will learn and grow and be able to convince your audience with the quality of your craft. In short, don't wait for an external circumstance to change because that is something you cannot control. Instead, take charge of what you can control, like practicing and learning and finding out what makes you really happy when working. From there, you'll be able to harness an endless amount of energy internally to create amazing works for your audience and your clients. And as you get better and better, you can charge more too. And that is it for all the questions. Let me know in the comment section if this has helped you in any way, and if you have further questions following what I've mentioned, feel free to comment below and I'll get to it. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also enjoy all the videos I have under the Wafer Paper Flowers playlist here. Hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next one.